Today we are going to talk about the Irish slavery meme. All these images support the idea that Irish people, particularly in the 17th and 18th centuries, were sent to the Americas as slaves. There are Facebook groups, articles, Twitter posts, all manner of people and places online that are perpetuating this meme. And it seems, especially in the wake of Ferguson and Charleston, that there's been an upshot in the popularity of this meme. 2016's Black History Month saw the most Google searches for Irish slavery ever, and it is often brought up to diminish the experience of African American people. The gist of it usually is, our white ancestors had it really bad, and we don't bother complaining about it, so why do you? It's actually gotten to the point where you can buy merchandising for this thing. You can buy an Irish slavery hoodie. That is a thing you can buy on the internet. I mean, you can also buy this inflatable unicorn horn for your cat, but that doesn't mean you should. And there's clearly a product that even the thing you're buying it for is going to judge you. There are a few books that started appearing around the early 2000s that broached this topic, but the main online source is a 2008 article posted on globalresearch.ca. The article in question is by a man called John Martin, and it is both unsourced and highly inaccurate. I don't want to get too bogged down in this article itself, but I couldn't find any statistics that matched up any of the statistics that actually were quoted in the article. For example, in his article, Martin says there was 1.5 million people living in Ireland in 1641, and a decade later the population was down to 600,000. Firstly, without getting into the nitty-gritty of Irish demography, you can't get an accurate census reading for Ireland before 1841. Secondly, the nearest estimate I could find to that was 850,000 people. 600,000 is an estimate number of people who died during the Confederacy Wars and the Cromwellian reconquest of Ireland, but that is not an estimate for the entire island's population at any time in this period. Martin also makes a point that 1,300 slaves were at one point drowned by one slave ship's crew because they wanted to have more food for themselves, but no ship of that period could hold that many people. Now, way back in the 17th century, there were many types of unfree persons. There were slaves, there were serfs, there were criminals, there were a myriad of others. We're going to look at two very specific ones here as relevant to this topic. We're going to look at indentured servants and chattel slaves. An indentured servant was generally a European who paid for their passage to the New World by agreeing to work for someone for 2 to 7 years. Now, there were indentured servants who were criminals or political prisoners or just poor people who were forcibly transplanted to the New World. And life for these people was not necessarily easy. They could have poor accommodation, they could have poor diets, they could be whipped, they could be fined, they could have their indenture extended. What is important to note is that the indenture itself was the property of the master, not the person. The Irish slavery meme tends to focus a lot on Irish people sent to the Caribbean. And if you were a political prisoner, for example, you could be sent off without any limit on your indenture. However, upon their arrival in Barbados, and this was a legal requirement, they were given a period of service based on their age. During their indenture, there were limits placed on these people. For example, they couldn't engage in commerce, they couldn't own guns, they couldn't command ships, and they couldn't get married. And while many did die from the hardships they endured, indentured servants were not servants for life. When their period of indenture was up, those people were free. At the end of an indenture, a servant would get what was called their freedom dues, which could be property, it could be money, but most importantly what they got was freedom. They became free members of society. Chattel slaves, on the other hand, were livestock. They were listed amongst inventories of cattle. Children of chattel slaves themselves became slaves. Life was brutal, harsh, and there was no chance of freedom. This meme perpetuates the idea that Irish slaves had the worst possible existence, and now, while the life of an indentured servant was not easy, the prime punishment for an indentured servant was the extension of their indenture. Yes, they could be whipped for assaulting their master, or they could be fined for a number of other things, but make no odds about it, chattel slaves had it far worse. The difference between the two is enshrined in the 1661 Barbados Slave Act, which sought to create a distinction between master, servant, and slave. Following that act, if a servant died, a master could not bury them unless the justice of the peace and 2 neighbours had seen the body. There was no such protection for African slaves. If a slave died, it wasn't a crime. A slave could be killed by anyone, even an Irish servant, for stealing. If an African slave assaulted a Christian, for the first offence they would be whipped, for a second they would be whipped, branded with fire and have their nose slit, and for a third there would be greater corporal punishment. For example, in 1654 a chattel slave stole a pig. That slave was then put in chains for several days, beaten for several days, and eventually had his ear cut off and fed to him. That slave was owned by an Irishman. The idea of the Irish slave meme supports 2 distinct narratives. One is nationalism, where indentured servitude is added to the mix with English subjugation and conflated with slavery either through ignorance or confusion. The other is that it is supported by racists and white supremacists. The proliferation of the meme has grown since 2014, not surprisingly in the wake of things like Ferguson and Charleston. This melding of ideologies results in a belittling of the African American experience. If you are interested in learning more about this subject, I would definitely suggest checking out the work of Liam Hogan. He's a Limerick-based historian who has been doing quite a lot of work on this topic. It's definitely worth reading.
Did you know the Irish was never really slaves? That's a myth. So a few years back, we had a story surface online about Irish slaves and the Irish slave trade. The entirety of this myth started from one website. A website with an article that was shared over 2 million times. So now there's a historian trying to debunk that myth. So if you're unfamiliar with the article, what it does is set up an Irish slave trade timeline, which runs from 1612 to 1839. And this was done purposely to make it look like the Irish slave trade was running concurrently with the transatlantic slave trade. In reality, the Irish that they're referring to were actually indentured servants and or prisoners of war. These Irish were mistreated, and it was approximately 10,000 of them. They were forcefully sent to the West Indies in 1650, but those that survived was pardoned by Charles II in 1660, 10 years later. So when you compare 10 years to 4 centuries, 10,000 to tens of millions, you do a little bit more than an injustice to history, and you do more to disconnect than connect by perpetuating this myth. Yo, I know it's St. Patty's Day. Majority of you guys is going to be drinking. I don't want you to go out and get drunk, walk up to some black guy and be like, yo, both of our people was enslaved. I know how it feels. Because in reality, you don't. And if that black guy drunk like you, he might punch you, and it's going to be misunderstood even though it's warranted.
White people. Quick question that you're probably going to flip around, turn around, study for hours and hours and come up with some regurgitated blah to answer with justifications of our genocide. But real quick fast, how do you keep coming to us trying to convince us white people were slaves with the Irish? No, the fuck you weren't. You were immigrants. Let's back that up and mention the fact that it's white on white crime. Y'all are violent people. It's always been white on white crime, but now you're flipping it around and trying to say black on black crime is the reason why you're ignoring all of our, genocide. Ain't nobody feeling sorry for you. You're going through all this crap in your head with your emotions, making systematic racism personal when it's not. It's on the social scale. It's bigger than you. It's bigger than me. We're not going to feel sorry for you over white on white crime whenever you can't even be honest about white on black crime.
You know, a lot of people, in order to get rid of their own guilt, they will try to minimize the significance of slavery and Jim Crow. They'll say things like, well, I wasn't there. That was a long time ago. You weren't there. Why are you upset about it? Other people were enslaved too. Other people were treated badly, so why are you whining about it? So there are all types of excuses and things people say now to minimize the significance of African-American slavery and Jim Crow.
I think that everyone who gets into these really long conversations with their white friends about racism, who are starting to feel like really bothered by it and really upset by it, just should unfriend these people. One of the things that I did on my personal Facebook page is to defriend basically everyone who started to post really shifty things, especially around the time of the whole Mike Brown situation. I definitely have made my social media experience a lot more positive because I got rid of all those like white people who were like slowly but surely revealing their hoods, their white hoods in the midst of that conversation.
The one thing that makes me mad is when people say it's not that bad. It's like me kicking you in your teeth, and I'm the one saying it's not that bad. You got kicked in the mouth.
But personally, I'm always kind of entertained when white people bring up the Irish or the Italian in conversations about racism, because they always really leave out like some of the most vital facts about that whole situation. First of all, the Irish were definitely enslaved, and not in the same way that Black people were slaves. I think it's important to understand that there are several different types of slavery. Most of the Irish were in indentured servitude, essentially. It was not comparable to the chattel slavery that Africans went through. It's just not even the same thing, but they were definitely enslaved, and they were definitely priced at a lower price than Black slaves. That's all very true. However, what people need to understand about the Irish when they came to America is that they were not considered white. Okay, whiteness is a construct, and that's something that I think people need to all understand. Whiteness is a construct, and there is a time where there are certain groups of people who we look at in America as white that weren't white at a certain point in time. The Irish became white through basically supporting anti-Black unions who were trying to exclude Black workers from the union.
When we look around and we see today in our politics a rich white man telling working class white people that their problem is brown people, we need to understand the historical pedigree of that. That is symbolic of the entire history of race and class politics in America. The history of rich white people telling working class and poor white people that their problem are Black and brown people. So beginning in the 1600s, that is what happens. Prior to about 1670 or so, there was no such thing as the white race, at least not recognized as such, called as such. That is not what people of European descent were when they were in Europe. They were English, they were Irish, they were Scottish, they were whatever they were. They were not white. Only in the colonies do we become white, and for a very specific reason, because in those early years of the colonial period, where you had white indentured servants, one level above enslaved themselves, and you had African-descended folks, some of them enslaved for life, others indentured servants also in the earliest years of the colonies. Those people would often see their interests as being common. They all realized that they were being screwed over by the same landowners, the same elite. They fomented various rebellions like Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia, others as well. And as a result, the elite in the colonies realized that they had to figure out a way to get the other folks from Europe on their team. So they created this mentality that said, you're now a member of the white race. You're on our team. You're wearing our uniform. Now you're at the end of the bench. You may not get in the game, but you're on our team, you see. So then they start putting white folks, now called, on the slave patrols, right? Didn't really give them any land or any real power except the power to control people of color, which is why folks of color say, and they are right, that modern policing traces to the system of slave patrols and slavery. And we have to be clear on that because that's the history, right? So whiteness was created to divide and conquer, to create the notion that even though you might not have much, at least you're not Black, at least you're not indigenous, at least you're not Mexican, at least you're not Chinese working on the railroads to build the transcontinental economy. You may not have much, but at least you have, as W.E.B. Du Bois said, the psychological wage of whiteness. And it's a trick that was played during the Civil War era on my people in the South, right? Rich folk, landowners in the South telling poor white folks who didn't own anything that they got to go out and fight to preserve the rich man's property in human beings. Fascinating. Why would you do that? Why would I go fight for your property? Well, because you told me that if I don't, these slaves are going to take my job. No, fool, they got your job. That's the point. If you got to charge $1 a day and you can make them work for free because you own them, guess who got the gig, Jack? Not you. So in fact, the system of enslavement was in the long run against the class interest of working class white folks, but they got suckered. Same thing happened in the union movement. You had white labor union folks who didn't want Black and brown bodies in their union because it would reduce the professionalism of the craft. No, fool, it'll double the size of your union. And then when you go out on strike, they can't replace your happy ass with the brown folk that you didn't want next to you in the first place. Because when they do replace you with them, then you will blame them, not the elite. See how that works? It's a trick. And it has worked for hundreds of years. It is working on some folk right now.
So it's true that, yeah, the Irish went through, you know, a lot of things in this country when this country was first established. It's also kind of facetious to compare that to the racism that the black people experience, because it's really not the same in America. If you're really interested in looking at looking into like the deeper history of this specific topic, I really suggest a book called How the Irish Became White. It's a really, really good resource. I think you can find a lot of it online, so look into that. Yeah, I think people need to all understand that, you know, both the Irish and the Italians are Catholic, usually. I mean, obviously not all Irish and Italian people are Catholic, but they're Catholic. And if you are an Irish or Italian and you want to, for instance, join the KKK, a lot of people will not accept you into the KKK because you're Catholic. There's a lot of like oppression of religion that's happened. You know, the oppression of the Catholics is very, very true. And I think it's also really important, as I'm thinking about this and realizing this, to understand that there's a difference between what happens in America and what happens in Europe. I think in the UK, they like very recently have removed anti-Irish signage on places. You know, so, and if you look at the demographics of like who is poor in the UK, there are more impoverished Irish people than any other white European group. So, you know, that's very true, that's very real in Europe. In America, not so much. You know, the Irish and the Italians both assimilated into whiteness in America. They, in a lot of ways, let go of their cultures, and a lot of ways let go of their languages and their customs that they had. There's a lot of lost history within the Irish and the Italians because of that, because the idea was they needed to be more like a white American, and they were, and now we don't really look at them as any differently than any other white person in America.
(1866) and up to about into the 1920s, black folk had the greatest economic achievement they've ever had in this country. Even though it didn't occur under integration, it occurred under segregation. Those black folk had managed to acquire over 20 million acres of land, according to the United States Census in 1920. 20 million acres of land. But between 1920s and 1950s, they lost almost all of it. Back in the 1920s and up to the 1940s, we had black broom factories, we had black mattress factories. Almost every black major city had at least 2 cab companies. We had black bus companies. We had black shipyard up here in Baltimore. When I say black bus lines, I'm not talking about just having 3 or 4 buses. We had over 500 buses. And this is in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And our bus company didn't just service just the black neighborhoods. It serviced the blacks and the white neighborhoods. We had 2 black cab companies. We had the Harris Cab Companies and the Campbell City Cab Companies. But they used to have their own restaurants. They had the best nightclubs in the country. The blacks had 2 baseball leagues. Each baseball league had 8 teams. We had over 500 of the best baseball players in the world. But what did they do? They wanted to integrate. So as soon as they put Jackie Robinson on the Brooklyn Dodgers, black folks said, we'll give up all of our black baseball leagues, black teams, and all our black players, and we can just get one black boy to play on a white team.
Black Americans were gung-ho about integration because we thought that would be our passport to freedom. We equated integration with freedom.
That scared whites to death. And see, at that time you had whites, a lot of these white separate communities. You had white Polish communities, you had white Jewish communities, you had white Italian communities, you had white Irish communities. And white folks said, well, if these blacks want to integrate, we're going to come together and organize as a unit. And so white folk then dropped all their little communities and said, no, we're going to organize as a one white block. We're not going to talk about I'm being Polish and you're Irish and German anymore. We ain't going to do that anymore. We're going to stick together as a group. We're not going to let all these blacks come and penetrate us.
So, you know, I think it's a silly comparison. And I think the thing I always say in response to those people is, how does that affect you today? Because I can trace how slavery affects me today. I can trace how slavery affects Black people to this day. And these things are observable. You know, the redlining of districts maintained legal segregation that was taken off of the books 52 years ago. So yes, it's true that, you know, they were oppressed, but how does it affect you today?
It doesn't matter whether you were around during slavery. It doesn't matter if your ancestors owned them or not. What matters is this: you benefit today from the enslavement of African people. And everyone who looks like you benefits in some way, shape, or form from the accrual of resources, of wealth, and of financial status that was reaped on the backs of my ancestors.
A common narrative now is that Black people shouldn't be upset because Africans enslaved other Africans, and there are a lot of holes in that theory. The thing is, there is no type of comparative slavery coming out of Africa. African people never had a slave-based economy. African people in Africa never had a shipbuilding economy based on slavery. They never had an insurance economy based on slavery.
Slavery had a different cut to it in Africa. European slavery is the slavery that is the unforgivable slavery. It's the most vicious.
When blacks sold other blacks into slavery, they thought it was the kind of slavery that they had, where you had to maybe work in the field, your family had to live over here on the side, you couldn't live here, your children had to go to school after my children. It was things like that. They had no idea it would be the kind of terror that was put upon us here in America, and they didn't come over here and go back and tell. And so they just were able to just keep shipping people through that system.
During the European slave trade in Africa, there were some Africans who complied with the Europeans, because basically when the Europeans went into Africa, they gave them an ultimatum. Look, we have these advanced weapons. Either you're going to be our slaves or you're going to help us make them our slaves. So you make a choice. So a lot of people were forced to comply with the Europeans.
3 things make American slavery different and black oppression different from everybody else's. Number 1, it was a process of dehumanization. No other slave in world history was dehumanized, prevented from identifying as a human being. Nobody else. We are the only people in world history who have ever been dehumanized. Number 2, your inability to learn was codified as a federal crime. Nowhere in history were slaves not allowed to learn, ever. You could be killed reading a book. You have never seen that in world history. And number 3, it's the only oppression where the whole world benefited. Everybody benefited from the enslavement of African people, and nobody did nothing about it. That makes your predicament different. So no matter how much we want to join ranks with the Latinos and the Asians and the Arabs, you have nothing in common with them. In fact, you need to be careful, because just like with the civil rights movement, they will use you again for your numerical strength and then abandon you at your time of need.
They're always trying to find a comparative form of slavery coming out of Africa, and the slavery there, the servitude there, was much different than European servitude. There's a book by an African gentleman. This was the first time an African who was captured in Africa and brought over to the New World, this was the first time he got to tell his story from his own perspective. A guy named Oluda Aguiano had a book that was a bestseller in the 1700s, and he talked about the difference of being enslaved in Africa and being in servitude in Africa and Europe. He talked about when he was in servitude in Africa, the people, the Africans who had him in servitude, they treated him like an extended family member. They treated him with a certain level of humanity and dignity. And he said once he got to the European slave ships, their slavery was something totally different. He'd never been beaten before. They were beating him. People were getting raped on the ship. So he specifically stated how barbaric the European slavery was as compared to the African servitude.
We have people today who deny that the history itself is even relevant to who we are as a nation of people and to what America represents in the world. There's no America without slavery. There is no economic dominance. There is no greatest American century without the capital produced by the work of black people in this nation. Point of fact.
A lot of historians now will try to make it seem like slavery was just this stain on the fabric of America, but in reality, slavery was the fabric of America. Cotton was king. Slavery was the #1 game in town. Let's not get it twisted.
I've heard a whole lot of negative things from the white people here. When you are trying to explain yourself, the white people don't want to hear you explain yourself. They drown you out. They start already trying to drown you out and talk over you. There's a certain amount of white arrogance here, and they don't want to listen to what black people are saying. They don't understand because they don't want to understand. I've heard a woman here say, go back to Africa. Somebody said, we have a black holiday. What does that mean? So what does that mean? He did not say that. He said, if we have a choice, what some of us can go and some of us can stay.
Just remember,
but there's no understanding in here. People are just trying to talk.
To those arrogant persons, you know, when you tell us go back, please remember where you came from. And when you want to relegate somebody to a specific place, just remember what your origin is in this world. Please, I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but I want you to understand that you, wherever you are on the earth, you are not a native anywhere. You came there and took it from the native people who are there. So please don't talk about going back, because if others talk to you about that, where would you go?
Go back to Africa! If you're an African first, go back to Africa! If you're an African first, go back to Africa! Go back to Europe! Nigga, go back!
You weren't worth shit to your own people, so that's why they came for ours. Get over it, because you're not dealing with it, you idiot. If y'all were smart enough to actually do the research, we wouldn't even be in this situation now. But you're not. It's that inbreeding. It fucks your brain up.
Fuck you! Yeah, fuck you too, bitch!
Dummy.
Participó también hacer un anuncio o un voto final dentro de una semana. Regreso contigo, Ramón.
Te están solicitando, Iris. Ay, Dios mío. Esperemos que esté bien.
People are upset about some things, darling. Why are they yelling? They want attention. They're trying to get attention so that people will listen to them.
This is our way of trying to get some media attention, because they are ignoring us, they're ignoring the anti-war movement, they're ignoring the anti-government movement. We love our country, but we cannot trust our government anymore.